Shalom from Jerusalem. This is Powers in Play, our monthly edition of a program looking at the global issues from a regional and Israeli perspective, but trying to cover the entire globe. And with us are today our Supreme Leader, the Editor-in-Chief, Jonathan Hassan, this time sitting in as one of the panelists. Hi, Jonathan. I'll give you back your seat shortly.
Yes, sir. Good to be here.
Reserve Brigadier General Dr. Amnon Sofrin, formerly with both military intelligence and Mossad. Welcome.
Thank you.
Our beloved Colonel Reserve Miri Eisin, again formerly with the Directorate of Military Intelligence, Prime Minister's Office, and many other distinguished establishments.
Lovely to be here.
And former Deputy Foreign Minister, Ambassador to Washington, and a long list of probably still secret endeavors. Danny Ayalon.
Good to be here.
Welcome to you. The subject is the person and the power. When we look at various powers, superpowers, regional powers, we'll get to lesser powers, we wonder whether the person leading them or about to lead them makes all the difference. So here we are, obviously a few weeks before the elections in the United States, but I would like to start, Miri, with lesser parties, Hezbollah and Hamas. We'll get to the bigger ones later. Is it Hassan Nasrallah? Is it Yahya Sinwar who makes the difference, who lets their organizations punch above their weight?
There's no question whatsoever that the person that leads has a really strong impact. But with both of these organizations, it's not just about the leader, which means that when Israel eliminated Sheikh Yassin 20 years ago, everybody was sure that would do something serious to Hamas. And here's Hamas 20 years later. Ismail Haniyeh is not around, and here's Hamas still out there. When it comes to Hezbollah, it's a bigger question. Because Hassan Nasrallah has had 30 years at the reins, that has its own impact, both to the strength of his leadership, but also to the weakness. Meaning, if the series of decisions that he's made, certainly over the last decade, are perceived now in a challenging way, that's going to challenge the leader, and that will have a big impact on the entire organization.
Jonathan, Nasrallah and Sinwar are leading militias, entities, which are both political and military. And one can hardly distinguish between the roles they play in such organizations. Does it matter if they are considered political leaders and then they are eliminated?
First and foremost, they're considered to be social leaders. They're part of clans, they're part of compositions in their respective communities, in their respective countries. And therefore, we need to look at it from a social construct. What are the implications of their activities? Who are the people surrounding them? Who are the people who are influencing them? And therefore, there is much of the clan politics that has a lot of significance also on the broader scheme of things and the broader politics. Each one of those clans has their own affiliation to separate countries where they are also able to draw their own power, be it Saleh al-Aghouri, who was in charge of the activities in Judea and Samaria at the time. He was seated in Turkey. He had strong connections with the Muslim Brotherhood in Turkey and Qatar and other places, but ultimately Turkey, when it decided to normalize relations with Israel, it was asked to expel that same individual. Did it impact the relationship between Hamas and Turkey in a significant degree? There are question marks there. Nevertheless, the Iranians were able to exploit it and were able, once he moved to Lebanon, to operate from there in collaboration, in concert with the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, a Palestinian group which is a proxy of Iran, as well as with Hezbollah, you saw this specific individual gaining significant power that ultimately positioned him within the organization at a higher stake. And therefore, the political aspects of their decision-making grants them that tool or decision or power to also employ military means that then also draws in the various clans to adhere to whatever he decides and puts forward.
General Sofrin, in your experience, among other duties, you were the intelligence officer for the Central Command when Israel and Jordan signed their peace treaty. And in both those peace neighbors that Israel has, Jordan and Egypt, the question is it the ruler or the regime? When you and your colleagues looked at Amman and Cairo, did you try to follow what could happen once a certain ruler, such as Sadat when he was assassinated, would that change the entire regime and with it the outlook and the policy vis-a-vis Israel?
First of all, when you sign peace accords between two countries, that means that the leaders are leading that. Okay, in the case of Israel and Jordan, it was Prime Minister Rabin on one hand and King Hussein on the other hand. There was secret and concealed links between those two leaders for many years, and therefore the peace accords were signed quite easily or quite naturally. With the Egyptian side, it was a little bit complicated because of other reasons, but nevertheless, when Sadat decided to sign the peace accords with Israel, and in return he got all the Sinai Peninsula, except from the small piece of Gaza that it didn't want to get back, and it left us to deal with that. And when Sadat was assassinated, there was some kind of worriness within the Israeli government. What is going to be next? When President Mubarak got into power, is he going to change the policy or not? But he was obliged due to, first of all, economical reasons and the support of the United States, and that was the decisive effect on his decision to go on and keep on going on with Israel with the peace accords.
But when the period of preparing for the succession is longer, such as when King Hussein was terminally ill and it was known that he will probably let one of his sons take over rather than his brother Hassan, what was your job or the job of those who watched the regime?
We were not worried too much about what is going to be the future of the relations between Israel and Jordan, because it was solid. We didn't have really disagreements before. So the small issue that was solved during these peace accords actually was so solid that it couldn't be thrown away without any reason, just for the sake of somebody else.
Danny, democracies elect their leaders, and once every few years they change them. Recently, in countries such as Japan and Great Britain, they swap their leaders frequently, sometimes 4 times in 6 years or so. How do ambassadors, whose job now is to watch the scene more than to relay messages because the leaders converse directly, how do you prepare for the eventual transition to a new president in Washington or prime minister in another country? Are you and your staff making sure to be in with the outs?
Well, that's a very good question. I would say that if you are representing your country in a fellow democracy, in the case of Israel, you have to hedge. Simply because always the political, arena is not very stable, especially if you have democracies like in the parliamentarian system. United States is a little bit different, but still, you have to hedge by that, meaning that even when you are, of course, dealing with a incumbent or incumbent regime, you always meet the opposition. So if there is a transition, and sometimes the transitions could take place, like in Britain, over a month, then you always have your good connections. So this is not a real issue for embassies. The real issue is, of course, the policies. And this is something which is much bigger. And here I would say that there is an inherent advantage for dictatorship. Let's take Putin vis-a-vis Biden or vis-a-vis even Trump. Dictatorships, they stay for a long time. So there is a continuity with their, and predictability maybe, with their policies and with their conduct. If you take Iran, for instance, Trump was very hard on Iran. He was replaced, and the policy was changed in a manner that allowed Iran to be where it is today. Putin, when he needed to support the Assad regime, he doesn't have anybody to account for. He's making a decision, and he's doing it. Now, I know, Amir, that you like and appreciate very much cliches.
I like Assad.
So,
The Assad family.
So let me invoke Churchill, who said, Churchill said that democracy is the worst type of regime, except there's none better. So we are really, in the long time, always democracies win. We see it in World War I, World War II, and even today. But it takes a long and winding road. And in the short time, unfortunately, the upper hand is with dictatorship as we see it now.
I was thinking that you, Danny, are the worst panelists, except for all the others. So Miri, if we know that the incoming leader may change his staff, his cabinet, his policy, what do we do, including intelligence agencies with their information operations? What do we do to prepare and perhaps shape the next administration in various countries?
So I'm going to push back at your question a bit, because if we think that we can shape the policies of other countries, I'd say that's jumping on a very high hill that I'd be very wary about. You want to understand the policies. You want to understand the implications to yourself, and you certainly want to impact them. But I'm a little disturbed by the idea that we shape them. So what do we do? First of all, it's really important to have constant things. I think this is also in continuation to what Danny was saying before on the diplomatic front, that you want to have relations with what I'm going to call the mid-levels. Because the mid-levels bureaucracy, meaning the people like Amnon and myself, or for that matter, Danny, who worked within the system for many years.
The deep state?
The deep state, right? Okay. We're the ones, it's called yes minister and yes prime minister. It's the people who are there, who are doing the actual work, and they don't change when everybody else changes. It's going to be a different type that changes. And if you have a strong relationship there, there is a continuity within all of the changes. Second aspect is really trying to understand beforehand, continuously, what are the policies? Were we surprised when President Trump changed the policies about Iran? Were we surprised when President Biden changed the policies again about that? Meaning, if you know that up front, then you can take better action yourself in trying to impact, as I said, perhaps not shaping the upcoming changes in policies.
Jonathan, you're associated with the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C. And think tanks are sometimes governments in exile. In addition to their day-to-day work, you consider perched in in Massachusetts Avenue and other places, people who were with the former administration. Hopefully their party will win. They will come back. Perhaps they will get an upgrade to a more senior post. Do they have any impact?
They do. They do. Of course, we need to remember that think tanks are, in essence, a 501c3, and therefore they cannot endorse a leader. They're in their own lane. They need to focus on their own lanes, and they propose policies. However, when we're talking about the people, for instance, in Hudson Institute, you have people like Nikki Haley, you have Mike Pompeo, you have General McMaster, people who were active participants in the previous Trump administration. And if according to the circulating chatter, if somebody like Mike Pompeo is going to assume a next role and he is heavily involved in writing a certain policy paper, naturally he is prone to take either all or part of that policy.
But Kamala Harris said that she will appoint a Republican to her cabinet. Maybe one of those.
Kamala Harris also said in the debate that she doesn't know about any Americans deployed in war zones. It doesn't necessarily mean that in a campaign, when we're hearing all kind of things in a campaign, ultimately what comes down to it, when those people in the think tanks, be they in the right of center, left of center, right or left, there are different individuals who are going to take this mid-level position or that mid to senior level position that are going to have a lot more impact.
What used to be called the Sherpas preparing the summit meetings.
Right.
Amnon, we see that Putin, who was mentioned here, and Xi in China are strong leaders and are there for the duration. Is it really a constant, or can there be sudden upheavals, assassinations, perhaps some medical emergency? Can one prepare when you are so used to a Putin? Can you prepare for a sudden succession? This is not the time of Brezhnev, Chernenko, the Andropov, the elderly leaders of a stagnant Soviet Union. How can you prepare for a Putin succession, for instance?
I don't know if you can prepare for that, because he's still quite young compared to Brezhnev or Andropov or all these dinosaurs, okay, who are very old, all of them. He's in good shape. He's in good health.
Extreme sports, yeah.
Extreme sport, right. He's in good health. So I don't see that something unexpected is going to happen. And if so, somebody from the inner circle will replace him. And the continuity of this policy will go on. It won't change. Same goes with China.
But only last year we had the Wagner force, Prigozhin, all of a sudden descending on Moscow. Couldn't such an event happen again?
Of course it can happen again, but the fate of Prigozhin and the fate of Wagner force was known to everybody. He dropped off some helicopter or some airplane out of the sky without any help, without any parachute. He didn't survive, unfortunately. And all the Wagner force was totally demolished and spread away. And they are now in Africa, most of them. They don't fight under what they call the Russian flag in Ukraine and so on. And everybody will send the message. So I don't think that somebody is going to try one more time to challenge Putin like that.
If I can just jump in onto that one there.
Go ahead.
It's an excellent example when we're talking about leadership and organizations and who does that of, so what would have been better, a Putin or something led by anything of the Wagner Group, which was such a scary prospect upon itself, meaning it wasn't that that's the positive change that you're looking for, so that you don't know what to expect, but is that something that you want to look at? And I just think that we always have to step back for a moment and go, so what's going to come after the leader that we know? And even if it's a bad leader, could it be even worse? And that's a question both nearby, who's going to be after Nasrallah, who's going to be after Sinwar, but also far away.
But we had our own example.
Hey, we're something else.
In Lebanon.
In Lebanon.
Moussaoui and
Nasrallah.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
It's always the question, the devil you know vis-a-vis the devil you don't.
Really.
Maybe it won't be a devil. Maybe it will be
An angel.
The righteous among the nations. Danny, Miri...
there are no angels only in heaven.
That's true.
Not here.
Miri earlier talked about mid-level officials, people who would be in senior staff positions, the constant mechanism of government. Regarding elected officials, when you served at the Washington Embassy and, of course, in other periods, Israel used to, or at least tried to cultivate junior relatively junior elected officials, hoping that they will grow to become contenders and maybe leaders. You would send attorneys general from the states, mayors, governors. Can you talk about that?
Absolutely. I think, yes, one of the secrets of Israel's good relations with the United States is not just, what we know, the obvious, fellow democracies and interests, shared interests and threats and all that. But also you have to have the personal touch. This is very, very important. When you don't have the personal touch, we see some, you see Bibi Netanyahu vis-a-vis Clinton or vis-a-vis Obama, or vis-a-vis even Biden. It wasn't the same as when you had, let's say, Rabin and Clinton. So, you can really do things which are intimate and you can really forge a future together. Sharon and Bush, George W., was the same thing. They could really think of what to do. They had a trust of each other. Now we don't have the trust. We do not have the trust in the very upper levels. It influences the entire, I would say, echelon.
So there was a consul general in one of the consulates in the southeastern,
In Houston, I believe.
in Houston, named Evroni,
Yes.
who took pride in discovering George W. Bush when he was the governor of Texas, perhaps even earlier when he owned the Texas Rangers baseball club. And in the foreign ministry, it's a feather in your cap. You discovered a future president.
Well, absolutely. But does that mean that this can really gauge your future? I'm not sure. You mentioned this Mr. Vroni, which I appreciate very much. He really wanted, he actually staked a claim to become ambassador when Bush was elected. But I can tell you from...
Who did become ambassador?
Let me see. Here.
Oh,
one
okay.
sitting here. And one,
Amazing.
It's not Miri, it's not myself, and it's not Jonathan.
let's just say,
Coincidence.
Let's just say he's one of the panelists, but without
Right.
mentioning, not naming names. But I would say here that it does make a difference, but for a very short while. The fact that, let's say, the consul general in Houston knew very well the governor, Bush, it's in the beginning, the governor, he knows only him. So he would pick his phone and talk to him and all that. But very, very quickly, he understands what is the balance of power. So very quickly, Bush and his advisors are reaching to the top, to the prime ministers, to the foreign minister, and then the one who discovered falls very quickly by the side.
You wanted to add, Miri?
The cultivation of the future leaders is actually something which is incredibly important in democracies, in the sense that both in the UK or in France, anywhere in Europe, but let alone in the United States, somebody who has been to Israel, somebody who has seen for himself what goes on here, that first exposure impacts the way they're going to see their policies as they go on. And in that sense, it may have been specific consul general or somebody else, but I've had in that sense, I like to call it the fun or the pleasure, where you bring in a variety of different people that come here, and they can be senators or governors. And what they view here, what they see here in the days here, they're going to meet a variety. I think that that's been one of the strengths all of the years of looking at that variety, so that you're not just with the power in play, you're also looking at the future powers in play. And to me, the most important part, at least with the United States, is to continue to do so in a bipartisan way. It doesn't matter how we view the future. It's about the future of the United States, and that all of the powers in play in the United States are supposed to be contenders, and that we need to cultivate them all.
Former Vice President Richard Nixon, before he became the candidate for the presidency and then the president, always mentioned that when he was out of power and seemingly not important, Chief of General Staff Yitzhak Rabin took him on a helicopter flight to the Golan Heights. When Rabin became the ambassador to Washington, he had an entree into the Nixon White House.
By the way, it was the same case with Arik Sharon and George W. When George W. was still a governor of Texas, Arik Sharon took him in a special helicopter tour over Judea and Samaria, Golan Heights, and everything, and they remembered it, and Bush remembered it very well, and took very kindly and was very fond of.
And then they landed at his farm and had a good
no,
steak
but
dinner.
what he did tell me, according to American policy, they cannot actually visit the Judea.
They can
and
hover
Samaria,
above it.
right. So he says what Sharon did, he instructed the pilot of the helicopter to actually go down maybe 10 centimeters over the ground.
But without touching the ground.
Without touching the ground, yeah.
Jonathan, there are families of senior politicians who are Jewish themselves or married to Jews, or their son-in-law or daughter-in-law are Jews, and some of them convert to Judaism. We have Ivanka Trump and her husband Jared Kushner. Now we have the second gentleman, Doug Emhoff. Is that an influence, or do they stay out? Are they careful not to involve their faith, their communities, so that there will not be any blowback?
Well, naturally, when we're talking about American leaders, and that's what you're referring to, I think there is a factor there, but it doesn't impact their decision-making to the degree where ultimately, when you look at people like Antony Blinken, he has his own understanding, a very activist type oriented personality that had, of course, a certain appreciation for the nation state of the Jewish people. Nonetheless, he did always emphasize the humanitarian angle, be it vis-a-vis Israel, but not only vis-a-vis Israel, vis-a-vis Egypt and other places. To what degree is that impact? I think it's very individual. I think that people like Barney Sanders, you mentioned earlier, people who come to Israel and experience, I think Barney Sanders, who came here to the kibbutzim, had a complete different experience than other people who did that same trip. So we need to take everything with a grain of salt. It's very individual. It's very focused on that. But if I may take one step backwards, and I think that, for instance, about the Bush family, the majority of discussions about the biggest influence on the Bush family was not Israeli influence. It was Prince Bandar of Saudi Arabia, who had a very close relationship with the Bush family and was able to leverage that for foreign policy vis-a-vis the kingdom and other elements in that. We can see the levels that this influence has is not only about state actors, it's also about non-state actors.
But Bandar, of course, he represented an important country, but it was also his longevity on the job. And now his daughter is the ambassador. And Danny would have stayed as long as Dobrynin or Bandar, but he had more pressing business, so he came back to Israel.
Yeah, I would never become the dean of diplomats in Washington, D.C., like Bandar did.
Right.
Amnon, sometimes prime ministers or ministers of foreign affairs or defense ministers go on to become the leader, the secretary general of an international organization, such as the UN or NATO. Is there any influence, if you had a good relationship with them, a bilateral one? Does it carry on to the organization?
Let's say, for example, NATO. NATO is a great organization with 32 countries that are members today of this organization, of this treaty, and Israel is not there. And even though the next or the current commissioner, which was the former prime minister of Netherlands, is fond of Israel and likes Israel very much, but it doesn't give us any advantage, because there is a policy of the countries that are sharing this treaty, and they don't want Israel inside. So the fact that he likes us and the fact that we have good relations with him doesn't affect us.
But on the margins, when, of course, the Secretary of General of NATO is subject to the North Atlantic Council, and the ambassadors get their instructions from home.
Right.
It's very cumbersome. But on the margins, sometimes, especially in emergencies, he can indicate to his subordinates that some Israeli requests be expedited.
He can do that if he decides to do that. If it is according to the policy of NATO. Okay? As long as it's within the lines of the policy, it's okay. If it goes out of the lines, he won't pay any concessions to Israel.
Miri, you have a lot of experience both with visitors and when you go abroad. Do most people you meet conflate the country with its current prime minister? When they, of course, it's very natural to personalize. When you talk with people, do they see Israel as Netanyahu or earlier Bennett or even earlier Olmert and Sharon?
There's a difference between Netanyahu and everybody else. Because Netanyahu has been so many years, it's become so synonymous of Bibi Israel that when you come in, you have to come in and say, I want to talk about Israel, and you talk about policies, but you need to present government policies. And to do that distinction between a government policy that at the end, Netanyahu was both in the 1990s, but he's been pretty persistent for over a decade, since 2013. That's a very, very long time. 2009, 2013. It's such a long time. It's hard to separate. And the one thing that I have found that's different for Israel when it comes to powers in play is that most people are not willing to make that distinction. Meaning, if you come in and you talk about the United States and you talk about the administration and you make a distinction between Democrats and Republicans, it's obvious to everybody that there's an administration and then there's all sorts of other opinions. When it comes to Israel, if you want to come and say, I can oppose the prime minister and I support what we're doing in the war, they're like, no, you can't do both. I'm like, you absolutely can do both. I can be against policies of the prime minister and support the overall effort of the state of Israel.
Much like a president and the Congress.
Absolutely, but it's accepted about other places in the world. And for Israel, that's one aspect. And I think part of it is the longevity of a democratic leader in a country where we have had a democratic elected leader for many, many, many years. I'll remind everybody, he was elected once by name in the 1990s, but from 2009, it's by the coalition government. It's not that he's elected. And that's very long. There isn't something to compare to that in the democracies of the world.
Danny, you were in Washington when the sudden transition from Sharon to Olmert took place. What was the reaction there of Bush, Condoleezza Rice, and the others?
Well, initially, I think there was some dismay because they really had very good rapport and understanding with Sharon. If you recall, Amir, the entire engagement from Gaza was done together, side by side. The American administration and the government of Israel. Basically, it was the Sharon team and Bush team and Condoleezza. So always when there is a new leader anywhere, Washington goes into a tizzy. They have a very, very, I would say, a manual of what to do. And of course, they have, to gather all the intelligence about him. With Olmert, it wasn't too bad because Olmert was the deputy of Sharon, deputy prime minister, and Sharon used to send him every once in a while to Washington, D.C.
To get him out of Jerusalem.
Not only that, because he had to do something with him, and what he told me, Sharon was, listen, I have to do something with him. He is pressing for me to go to Washington, so I'm sending him to Washington, arrange for him all the meetings, but make sure he only listens and doesn't talk. So anyway,
impossible with Olmert.
Anyway, so it was after the initial surprise. They knew who Olmert was, and again, the systems was the same. If you recall, the same people that surrounded Sharon kept with Olmert. So that is the way. And for that matter, Bush and Olmert, they kind of the same age, same generation. In a way, they spoke to each other in a much easier manner than Bush and Sharon.
because Bush looked up to Sharon.
Exactly.
Go
I'll
ahead.
just give one example. I think Danny and I were both in the room that time when President G.W. Bush at the time sitting opposite Olmert, and it was during the World Cup, if you remember that one there, where President Bush said, "Oh, soccer, that's the game where you watch the grass grow." And then they went on to talk about other different sports. So, but they definitely had that one in common. They both liked sports. It was very interesting. They built a rapport, and you could see that there.
That's in 2006, the Italy versus France.
Yes.
In
And
the-
then
in the final.
the fruits came in 2007 with the elimination of the nuclear
reactor.
facility.
But during that game, the Italian ambassador, whose residence is in Ramat Gan, invited the Minister of Foreign Affairs, whose residence was in Ramat Gan. He no longer lives there because he changed some of his familial connections. But it was part of his cultivation of the minister. Yes, go ahead, Amnon. You wanted to add to, or to subtract from what Miri said.
No.
Now, when administration change, does the new one look askance at ties with the old ones? Or vice versa. We know that in the transition between Obama and Trump, even though Obama was not a candidate, he served out his 8 years, the Obama people did not like Israeli officials already during the transition between November and January 20th, trying to get in touch with the incoming administration. Can you add to that?
Well, everybody here spoke about the personal relationship. That is so important. Be it people right now within the Trump campaign, where you hear the personal relations being forged or being maintained to a certain degree on multiple levels to maintain that relationship, but also with the Kamala Harris team. If you see Phil Gordon, for instance, he's somebody who has very close connections with different people here in Israel. But nonetheless, his policy is very similar to the incumbent rather than the one of Trump. When we look at the big picture, and I think that we need to understand that we're living in very dire circumstances right now, particularly at a time when, since 2022, we see the Chinese and the Russians establishing a no-limits relationship mere few days before the Russian invasion into Ukraine. We see the various joint maneuvers of Russia and China forcing the United States to abandon its posture of 2 aircraft carriers in the Middle East, sending the USS Roosevelt back to San Diego, to its home in the Pacific, in order to establish a counter-deterrent to Moscow and Beijing in the Pacific. We're seeing the Americans understanding and comprehending the severity of Iranian threats towards Israel and its allies and partners in the region, not only Israel. Sending now, yet again, the USS Truman to bolster, once again, 2 aircraft carriers and 1 AOR, which is not something the Americans usually do, particularly not in the Middle East. So we're seeing a lot of those different things occurring right now. Do I think that the one administration versus the other are going to alter that posture within current circumstances? I doubt that.
General Sofrin, as a veteran intelligence official, can you at least satisfy some of our curiosity regarding intelligence chiefs who go on to become leaders? And we can name 3, for instance. Andropov of the KGB, Bush, senior of the CIA, and Ehud Barak of military intelligence. And Putin, who was not the chief, he was only a lieutenant colonel, but obviously kept the legacy and surrounded himself with veterans.
When you look at the Israeli military establishment, at least great part of the chief of general staff were the heads of the military intelligence before. If you look at Herzl Levy, if you look at Ehud Barak, if you look at others,
Aviv Kochavi, and Moshe Ayalon.
and they gave them a great advantage because they knew to look at the great picture and to look at the strategic picture and to try to analyze it by themselves, even though they were assisted and advised by others. Same goes with the Prime Minister. You have a great advantage when you know the intelligence work and you know how to direct the people exactly what you're looking for.
Tasking.
Yeah, correct. I think this is a great advantage, and I think that these people gain a lot of power by using the capabilities and their knowledge in order to get more information and more intelligence picture, a broader picture that will assist them in decision making.
And sometimes not in Israel, of course, when such an official meets a counterpart, he knows that the other guy knows that this is a source earlier used by intelligence, and this is for another time, of course. General Sofrin, Jonathan Hessen, Miri Eisin, Ambassador, Deputy Foreign Minister Danny Ayalon, thank you. And we will be back with another edition of Powers in Play next month. For the time being, shalom from Jerusalem.